The blood drained from my fingertips as my mother's words hit me through the phone speaker. I know you paid off the $680,000 mortgage, but we're gifting the house to your brother as his graduation present. The contract in my other hand, 5 years of monthly payment confirmations, suddenly felt weightless. Behind her voice, I heard laughter, party planning, the clink of glasses being arranged for a celebration I'd never be invited to. "And you're not invited to the party," she added, almost cheerfully, like she was discussing weekend plans. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of every sacrifice I'd made, every late night I'd worked overtime, every vacation I'd skipped to keep their house from slipping into foreclosure. My chest tightened as I realized they'd been planning this moment while I was still writing checks. After hanging up, I drove straight to my Uncle Edward's house, the only family member who knew the truth about those payments. His eyes met mine with that steady expression he wore when he'd already calculated what everyone else had missed. "You want to tell them," I said quietly, "or should I?" "My name is Grace. I'm 34 and a financial analyst. This is the story of how I reclaimed what was rightfully mine." Growing up in Rochester, our 2-story colonial house on Elmwood Street was the kind of place that looked solid from the outside. White siding, wraparound porch, flower boxes my mother tended like they were family heirlooms. But inside, there was a careful hierarchy that shaped every conversation, every decision, every dollar that came and went. My mother, Patricia Hamilton, ran her accounting firm with the same iron control she applied to our household. She had a gift for making her version of events sound like undisputable fact, especially when it cast her as the family's savior. My father, Michael Hamilton, a quiet electrician who worked long hours and longer weekends, rarely challenged her narrative. He'd nod along, adding just enough support to make it seem like he remembered things the same way. Then there was Connor, my younger brother, born 4 years after me, but somehow always years ahead in my parents' priorities. New laptops, spring break trips, tutoring when his grades slipped. Connor got the investment. I got, "You're responsible. You'll manage." By high school, I understood the unspoken rules. Connor's needs came first. Dad stayed neutral. Mom controlled the story. I learned to work after school, save for my own college fund, and expect nothing beyond the basics. Independence wasn't a gift in our house. It was a requirement disguised as praise. The first crack in their perfect facade appeared during my junior year of college. I'd come home for Thanksgiving, and while helping in the kitchen, I noticed a stack of unopened bank envelopes stuffed behind the coffee maker. The return address made my stomach drop. "Final notice," stamped in red across multiple envelopes. That night, I did something I'd never done before. I asked direct questions. The house was 3 months behind on payments. Dad's work had slowed during the recession. Mom's business had lost 2 major clients. They were drowning, but too proud to admit it, even to each other. "We'll figure it out," Mom insisted, but her voice had lost its usual certainty. I spent that entire weekend running numbers. My starting salary at the consulting firm, my current expenses, what I could cut. The math was brutal but clear. I could cover their payments for however long it took them to get back on their feet. It would mean living in a studio apartment instead of a 1-bedroom. It would mean brown bag lunches and generic everything. But losing that house would destroy them. The decision felt obvious, even if it wasn't easy. "I can help," I told them Sunday morning before driving back to school. Mom's relief was immediate and overwhelming. She hugged me like I'd just pulled her from drowning, which in a way I had. Dad squeezed my shoulder, his eyes bright with gratitude. "Just until we get back on track," Mom promised. "Maybe 6 months, a year at most." 6 months became a year became 3, 3 became 5. During those 5 years, something subtle but significant shifted. Mom stopped mentioning my contributions to the house payments. Instead, she'd tell neighbors and relatives how she and Dad had tightened their belts and made some smart financial moves to keep the house afloat. The story evolved each time she told it, always with her at the center, always with my role gradually disappearing. Meanwhile, Connor graduated college debt-free because I was handling the house payments. He took an unpaid internship at a design firm because there was no financial pressure at home. He dated, traveled, and explored his options while I worked 60-hour weeks to cover both my life and theirs. The irony wasn't lost on me. My responsibility had freed him to be irresponsible. But the real betrayal began 3 months ago during Connor's final semester. I'd driven down for his birthday dinner, and while helping Mom clear the table, I overheard her on the phone with Aunt Susan. "The house will make a perfect starter home for Connor," she was saying. "It's the least we can do after everything he's accomplished." My hands went still on the plates. Everything he's accomplished. As if his degree had somehow paid the mortgage. I told myself I'd misunderstood. Mom was just daydreaming out loud the way parents do. But over the following weeks, comments started adding up. References to Connor's house in conversation. Questions about whether he'd want to renovate the kitchen. Discussions about transferring utilities into his name after graduation. They weren't daydreaming. They were planning. That's when I called Uncle Edward, Mom's brother, and the only family member who'd known about my financial arrangement from the beginning. He'd actually been the one to suggest I protect myself legally. "Grace," he said after I'd explained what I was hearing, "please tell me you remember the trust." The trust I'd almost forgotten. 5 years ago, when I'd first agreed to take over the payments, Edward had insisted we formalize the arrangement through a legal trust. "Just in case," he'd said. At the time, it seemed like unnecessary paperwork for a temporary situation. "The payments you've made don't just establish financial responsibility," he reminded me. "According to that trust, they establish legal authority over the property. Your parents can't transfer the house without your consent." As the pieces clicked into place, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the power to say no. 2 weeks later, the family cookout by Lake Ontario was an annual tradition, the kind of casual gathering where cousins caught up, parents bragged about their kids' latest achievements, and everyone pretended our family was exactly as functional as it appeared. This year, though, the undercurrent felt different. There was an anticipation in conversations, a sense that people were waiting for an announcement. I found out what they were waiting for when I overheard Connor talking to our cousin Jake near the volleyball net. "Mom wants to have the deed transferred by the end of summer," Connor was saying. "She thinks it'll be good for me to build equity while I'm getting established." Jake nodded approvingly. "Smart move. That's prime real estate." Prime real estate. The house I'd kept from foreclosure was being discussed like a gift Connor had earned simply by existing. Across the picnic area, Mom held court with several relatives and neighbors, gesturing expansively as she told a story I'd heard variations of for months now. "Keeping that house was the hardest thing Michael and I ever did," she was saying. "There were moments we didn't think we'd make it. But you know us, we never give up on family." The collective murmur of admiration that followed made my jaw clench. Every word was technically true, but the truth she was telling had been carefully edited. She and Dad had nearly lost the house. They had worked hard to stabilize their situation. They had never given up on family. They'd just given up on acknowledging which family member had actually saved them. I looked around at all the nodding heads, the impressed expressions, the way people looked at Mom like she was some kind of financial wizard who'd single-handedly overcome impossible odds. Not one person asked how 2 people barely making ends meet had managed to catch up on months of missed payments while simultaneously covering current ones. That's when I made my decision. I walked over to where Uncle Edward was sitting at a picnic table, quietly watching the crowd with that patient expression he wore when he was already several steps ahead of everyone else's thinking. "Edward," I said, settling beside him, "I need to ask you something." He raised an eyebrow. "You want to know if they can actually transfer the house?" It wasn't a question. He'd been listening to the same conversations I had. "Or can they?" He was quiet for a long moment, then shook his head. "Not legally. The trust is ironclad. But Grace, once you enforce it, there's no going back. Your relationship with your parents will fundamentally change." I looked across the picnic area at Mom, still basking in praise for sacrifices she'd never made, and Connor, casually discussing his inheritance like he'd earned it. "It's already changed," I said. "I just haven't admitted it yet." That Monday, I took a personal day and drove to the law office of Margaret Chen, the attorney Edward had recommended. Her office was small but immaculate, with law books lining one wall and diplomas covering another. She had the kind of steady, no-nonsense presence that made you feel like your problems were solvable. Let me make sure I understand, she said after reviewing the trust documents and my payment records. You've been covering their mortgage for 5 years, and they're now attempting to transfer the property to your brother without your knowledge or consent. That's correct. She leaned back in her chair, tapping her pen against the desk. Grace, you're not just a family member who helped out with some bills. According to this trust, you're the legal financial authority for this property. They literally cannot transfer it without your signature. The relief I felt was immediate and overwhelming. For months, I'd been watching my family plan my erasure from their story. Now I had proof that I couldn't be erased, at least not legally. What are my options? Margaret outlined the process step by step. I could file a formal notice that would prevent any transfer of the property. The filing would trigger a review period during which all parties would be notified of the trust's terms and my legal standing. Any attempt to proceed with the transfer would be blocked until the matter was resolved. How long does the review process take? I asked. Usually about 2 weeks. But Grace, there's something you need to understand. The moment you file this notice, your family will know you've taken legal action. There's no way to do this quietly. I thought about Connor's graduation party, scheduled for the following weekend, the party where Mom planned to announce the house gift, the celebration of everything he'd accomplished. Can you file it today? She nodded. I can file it within the hour. Then do it. The following weekend, the graduation party was everything Mom had planned. The backyard was transformed with white tablecloths, string lights, and enough food to feed twice the number of guests. Connor, wearing a new suit that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, moved through the crowd accepting congratulations and talking about his bright future. I arrived fashionably late, after most of the initial socializing was done. Mom greeted me with a slightly strained smile. She was still annoyed that I'd been difficult about contributing to the party expenses, but she was too focused on her hosting duties to make an issue of it. Grace! So glad you could make it, she said, air-kissing my cheek. Connor's been looking forward to sharing his news with everyone. His news. As if the house had always been his to claim. I mingled politely, listening to relatives praise Connor's degree, his job prospects, his maturity. Several people mentioned how lucky he was to have parents who could give him such a head start in life. I smiled and nodded and waited. At exactly 3 p.m., just as Mom was preparing to call everyone together for the big announcement, a white sedan pulled into the driveway. 2 people in business attire stepped out carrying official-looking folders. The conversations around me quieted as they approached the group. "Excuse me," the woman said, scanning the crowd. "We're looking for Patricia and Michael Hamilton." Mom stepped forward, her hostess' smile faltering slightly. "That's us. Is there something wrong?" "We're from Pierce and Associates Legal Services. We need to serve you formal notice regarding a property dispute filed under the trust connected to your home at 1247 Elmwood Street." The silence that followed was absolute. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the music from the portable speaker seemed to fade. "I'm sorry," Mom said, her voice tight. "There must be some mistake. We're not involved in any property dispute." The man consulted his folder. "According to the filing, this property is subject to a trust agreement that grants financial authority to Grace Hamilton. Due to the terms of that trust, no transfer of ownership can proceed without her explicit consent." Every eye in the backyard turned to me. Connor's face went pale. Dad dropped the paper plate he'd been holding. Mom's expression cycled through confusion, disbelief, and then something that looked like betrayal. "Grace," she said, her voice barely audible. "What is this?" I stepped forward, my heart pounding, but my voice steady. "It's the trust Edward set up 5 years ago when I started paying your mortgage. The one you signed. The one that gives me legal authority over any decisions about this house." Connor found his voice first. "You can't be serious. You're ruining my graduation party." "I'm not ruining anything," I replied. "I'm just enforcing an agreement our parents made." Mom looked around the crowd of relatives and neighbors, all watching our family drama unfold in real time. Her carefully crafted image, the competent mother, the successful businesswoman, the family leader, was crumbling in front of everyone she'd wanted to impress. "We need to discuss this privately," she said through gritted teeth. We've had 5 years to discuss this privately, I answered. You chose to plan around me instead. The legal representative cleared her throat. Ma'am, this notice prevents any transfer of the property for the next 14 days while the matter is reviewed. If you have questions about the trust terms, I suggest consulting with an attorney. They handed over the official documents and walked back to their car, leaving behind a silence so complete I could hear birds chirping 3 yards away. Finally, Uncle Edward stepped forward. His presence seemed to steady the moment, give it some structure. Patricia, he said gently, maybe we should all sit down and talk about this like adults. But Mom wasn't ready for reasonable conversation. She turned to me with eyes that looked almost wild. How could you do this to your own family, today of all days? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Around us, I could feel people waiting, watching, judging. This was the moment where I either backed down and returned to my role as the silent family financier, or I stood up for myself in front of everyone who mattered to my parents. I chose myself. I didn't do anything to our family, I said, my voice carrying further than I'd intended. I saved it. For 5 years, I've been paying the mortgage on this house while you've been telling everyone you did it yourselves. I've watched Connor get a debt-free college experience while I work 60-hour weeks. I've listened to you plan his future in a house I've been financing, and I've never once asked for recognition or credit. My voice was getting stronger now, fed by years of suppressed frustration. But I will not stand here and watch you give away something I've paid for while pretending I don't exist. Connor stepped closer, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger. Nobody asked you to pay for anything. If it was such a burden, you should have said no. The casualness of his dismissal, the idea that my sacrifice had been optional while his benefits were inevitable, broke something loose in my chest. You're right, I said. I should have said no. I'm saying no now. Mom looked around at the stunned faces of our relatives, the neighbors who'd heard every word, the perfect party that had become a public confrontation. You've embarrassed us in front of everyone, she whispered. I've told the truth in front of everyone, I corrected. There's a difference. Dad, who'd been silent throughout the entire exchange, finally spoke. Grace, honey, maybe we can work something out, as a family. It was too little. Too late, delivered with the same diplomatic neutrality he'd always used to avoid taking sides. We had 5 years to work something out as a family, Dad. Instead, you worked around me. I looked at each of them, Mom with her shattered composure, Connor with his entitled confusion, Dad with his uncomfortable peacemaking, and felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Complete clarity about where I stood. The trust is being enforced, I said simply. If you want to discuss the house, you can contact my attorney. I turned and walked toward my car, leaving behind a party that had become a reckoning, a family gathering that had revealed exactly how much family I actually had. That evening, back in my apartment, the phone calls started. First Dad, then several relatives, all asking me to reconsider and think about what's best for the family. Uncle Edward was the only one who called to ask how I was doing. You okay? He asked. I was sitting by the window, looking out at the city lights, feeling simultaneously exhausted and oddly energized. I think so, I said. For the first time in years, I think I'm actually okay. The legal review proceeded exactly as Margaret had predicted. Within the full 14-day period, the trust was confirmed as ironclad, and my financial records were verified as comprehensive. The court officially recognized my legal authority over the property, making any transfer impossible without my explicit consent. What surprised me was how quickly my family adapted to the new reality. Within 2 weeks of the legal resolution, Mom had signed a lease on a rental property across town and began the moving process. Dad started talking about the freedom of not being tied to a mortgage. Connor, initially furious, began actively searching for apartment options near his new job after accepting that his inheritance was no longer possible. They adapted because they had to. Because for the first time in 5 years, my no actually meant no. 3 months later, when the dust had settled, I made my final decision about the family relationships. I initiated one last conversation with each of them to establish clear boundaries going forward. Mom and I now speak only during major holidays and keep our interactions brief and polite. Connor and I have no ongoing relationship. He made it clear he considers my actions unforgivable, and I've accepted that his resentment is permanent. Dad and I maintain occasional contact, though he remains frustrated that I won't just forgive and move forward without acknowledgement of what happened. Uncle Edward remains the only family member with whom I have a genuinely supportive relationship, and that connection has actually grown stronger through this experience. The house sits empty now while I decide what to do with it. I could sell it and recoup some of my investment. I could rent it out and build equity. I could even give it back to my parents, on my terms, with legal protections that ensure my contributions are acknowledged. But for now, I'm just sitting with the strange, powerful feeling of owning something I'd protected for so long. The quiet satisfaction of boundaries that hold. The knowledge that I can't be written out of a story I helped create. If you've ever found yourself financing someone else's dreams while your own needs go unmet, or if you've watched family members take credit for sacrifices you made, you understand the unique exhaustion that comes from loving people who've learned to expect everything and acknowledge nothing. Your generosity isn't weakness, your boundaries aren't cruelty, and your decision to stop being invisible isn't betrayal. It's the first honest thing you can do for a relationship built on your silence. The hardest part about reclaiming your place in your own story isn't dealing with their anger. It's dealing with the guilt they've trained you to feel for taking up space in your own life. But you belong in your own story, and you have the right to be seen in it. If this resonated with you, share your experience in the comments. Sometimes the first step toward being heard is admitting you've been silent too long, and hit subscribe, because stories like this need to be told until they don't have to be lived anymore. Before you go, here's a quick bonus for sticking around. If you love learning and growing like I do, you need to try audiobooks. I've got an exclusive deal with Audible. Your first month is completely free. That's access to over 500,000 titles. Zero cost to you. All the details are waiting in the description. Don't miss this one.